is being taped, and we will do as we have done in the past, and that is to, if you have a comment or question, to please go ahead, put your hand up on the side over here, so I can see who has their hand up. So just to go through the schedule a bit, what we hope to do today is essentially do a walkthrough and have staff explain, first of all, some new ideas Joe Gorney has come up with from the Fairfax County staff on the stormwater management issues. I know we have a small task force within our group that's looking at this issue. So we're hoping that that Joe's comments presentation will help inform that small group as they then work on further a set of issues. And then today really spend the bulk of time understanding what we're talking about with the land units. Because I think that, you know, this is the nuts and bolts of it all. And I think virtually all of us who had comments on this section were curious why we've gone from 29 different subunits to now 12. And is that really progress? Is that really what we're talking about? So for staff to give us some appreciation for what they were trying to accomplish with this language and their approach. One of the things as we talk about land units, Jim Peoples had asked us to look at this stretch of property sort of on the backside of what is now the Baltic Sea area. I think it's Holmes Place. The staff has asked us to look at that area one more time, and as they talk about the land units area, Jim is unable to join us today. He'll be on our call in September. But we have talked through this issue with him, and so we'll get into that a little bit as well. But so we'll go through and bring everybody up to speed in terms of why the staff has approached the land unit section the way they have them answer any questions that we have, and then hopefully we can finish up this last bit of language at our September meeting. At that point in time, we will hopefully have something figured out as to a public meeting, and to present sort of the near completed task force document, and listen to the feedback from the community, and then we'll get together again and look at comments that they have made and any changes we might want to make. So the staff will go through and they'll come up with the next iteration of language. We are not going to do a walkthrough of that language. I think that would be mind-boggling in terms of how much time that would take again. So when that does come out, I'll just need, you know, that nothing's approved until our final meeting, but just to make sure each and every one of us walks through. And again, if we have individual questions, send them into staff and we'll deal with things that way unless there's something that we think there has not been dealt with accurately in terms of how the task force is feeling. So that's sort of the general overview in terms of our timeline. And now, so David and I were trying to remember, it seems to me that we did actually go through and approve our July 20 minutes from last meeting, like about 15-20 minutes into our last meeting. I'm hoping that's the recollection of the rest of the task force, and we don't need to approve the July 20 minutes at this point in time, because I'm not sure at this moment we have everybody signed in. Is that the recollection of the rest of you, or is it just me being wishful? And of course, you're all on mute, so you'd have to unmute yourself in order to answer my question. Does anybody have a different recollection than mine?
I concur in your recollection.
That is perfect. All right, thanks, Bill. Okay, so therefore, and the August 10 minutes are not yet ready to be reviewed and voted on. So we'll hopefully have 2 sets that we'll vote on in September. Okay, so with that, let's get started with Joe on the stormwater management issue. Joe, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Kim. And I'd like to say that Katie Torgerson is here. We were also hoping we could have Camlyn Lewis, another staff member. Katie Torgerson is in Department of Public Works and Environmental Services. She works in our stormwater planning division. Camlyn Lewis, who we've been talking with, having some internal meetings. Camlyn is from the Land Development Services. So Katie pretty much covers the stormwater planning side of the house, and Camlyn is involved with the Land Development Services or the site review side of the house. So she gets into the nuts and bolts of the regulation and when projects come through. So what we tried to do was bring an appreciation to the various stormwater issues and criterias from the perspective of obviously the land use planning, environmental planning, the stormwater planning, and then the site review as well. One of the things that we wanted to do was last time there were some questions about the various things that are happening in the McLean CBC area. So what Katie has done to try to start the conversation, and I'm going to turn it over to her in a second here, is to do some analysis of what's actually going on in the McLean CBC. As we talked about in the last meeting, there's been quite a bit that the county has been involved with, and Katie has done some analysis of that. So essentially, she's looking at the background for the McLean area, and then she also looked at a hypothetical, or excuse me, I'll back up a little bit. She also looked at one of the sites that was recently developed in the area, the Signet site, and then a hypothetical development scenario. And with that, at the end of the day, what we hope to do is, based on that information, there are some possibilities of how to proceed with stormwater language in particular. And we want this to just kind of open up the conversation to that. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Katie, and she can talk about the information that she's put together for this meeting.
Hello, everyone. So I'm with the Stormwater Planning Division, and I'll just kind of give you an overview of the McLean CBC area and the surrounding neighborhoods. So the city is on a drainage divide. So the northern half drains to the Dead Run watershed, and the southern part drains to the Pimmet Run watershed. Much of the area in McLean was constructed prior to stormwater water quality and quantity control regulations. So you see older stormwater infrastructure, like the pipe system, and few detention ponds and things like that help slow the water down. So in essence, water that falls on the CBC runs, down through the pipe system and drains into McLean Central Park. So that's where the Dead Run stream ends and then or starts. And then on the southern side, it drains to kind of the confluence of what's known as like Saucy Branch and Pimmet Run. So both of these watersheds, that lack of detention and kind of the stormwater management infrastructure has led to significant structural and yard and road flooding in the surrounding neighborhoods, and significant stream erosion as well. And that's represented by the red dots represent the flooding complaints that the county has received, and as well as there are also erosion and other kind of drainage associated complaints there. The county has invested millions of dollars to help rectify and mitigate some of the stream erosion. So we work within the stream valleys where we have the easements and the access, and that includes a lot of work in Dead Run watershed. So we've restored the stream from Dolly Madison Boulevard up to Churchill Road, and then the segment up to Georgetown Pike is under design, and we've done additional pieces throughout the Dead Run watershed. And on the Pimmet Run watershed side, we've got multiple projects in design. They're just off the page here, kind of lower in the watershed, and some neighborhood stormwater improvement projects as well to help mitigate some of that flooding. So we're trying to address the problems at the stream, but it really helps to take more of a watershed approach and try to stop and slow the water at the source. So that would be, right in the CBC area. As it stands right now, the area is highly impervious. So as it redevelops, hopefully you'll see a reduction in impervious and some more green space that'll help with that. And then integrating that water quality and quantity pieces into the designs and development as well. And so on the next slide, we go over to the recent development, the Signet condominium project. So this converted, I think it was a parking lot into condominium complex with some green space. And so this, I think, highlights kind of the type of stormwater management you see on these projects. It's a larger site, but it did take it reduced the amount of imperviousness on the site by about 15%. And then it took one of the few existing underground detention facilities, so these large vaults that hold and store and release water slowly. It replaced an older one with a new one. So that helped really with the quantity control for some of these larger storms. And then it integrated water quality best management practices like bioretention planters and permeable pavement into the design as well. So that helps, with filter pollutants out of the water before they run into the pipe system. But it also provides some quantity control. So it also holds and stores some water too. And I guess onto the next slide. On the stormwater world, there's kind of like two areas that we focus on. There's the water quality piece and the water quantity piece, which goes towards more the flood protection. So for quality, we're generally looking at these really frequent storms because you want to design things for a lot, the storms that you see the most. So the 1-inch storm is what you see a lot of these best management practices that you may be a little bit more familiar with, like permeable pavements and the bioretention areas and bioswales. So they're designed for the more frequent storms. But when you look at flood protection, you're generally going to focus on the larger storms that may get out of the conveyance system or generate a lot of rainwater. And that's the 10-year to 100-year storm. So I think in the design world, they like to look at the 24-hour storm. I think in real-time world, sometimes, especially recently, we've been looking at, these cloudbursts that come with these thunderstorms and in the 2-hour time frame drop a couple inches of rain and can cause a lot of havoc, especially where you don't have the infrastructure that you need. So for this discussion, we're kind of looking at the 10-year 2-hour storm, which is a 2.56 inches of rain that would fall. So keeping that in mind, go to the next slide. I wanted to try to put this in perspective and what this means in terms of, detaining 2.56 inches of rain to help mitigate flooding. So took this site, you may all be familiar with it. This is the Wells Fargo Bank and parking lot right at the corner of Old Dominion Drive and Beverly Street. So it's a smaller one. And basically, to come up with a volume of water that would fall on the site that would need to be managed, I assumed that, you know, this site was to go and redevelop. Right now, it's probably at least 90% impervious. So you would assume maybe there'd be a slight reduction in the amount of imperviousness. It's a smaller lot, so they're still trying to get a lot onto that site. But maybe you'd assume like 85% imperviousness. So the lot's, you know, 85% paved. And so any rain that would fall on there would immediately run off the site. So we would want to catch it. And we're trying to capture that 2.5, you know, inches of rain that would fall. So you would assume that under our normal stormwater regulations, so the minimum requirements that people would have to meet, they would have to detain some water because of, you know, the older infrastructure and because just the way things, the way the regulations are written. You'd assume there would be some detention, and they may get that through putting these water quality BMPs in, so maybe some bioretention or something along those lines. Or, and what's very common now is they would just put in these underground stormwater vaults. So I wanted to give you an idea of what the sizing for these vaults would look like. So you assume they have to put in some sort of detention. But we know that we need more in this area because of the multiple impacts downstream from flooding in particular. So that's kind of the priority here. And so I looked at like, what would it mean to detain 40% of that 10-year 2-hour storm, or 60%, and up to 80%. So you've got a range of detaining between 2,000 cubic feet of water to about 4,000 cubic feet of water. And that's just represented by assuming that you've got a 4-foot deep hole, basically. This is kind of the size of what each of those vaults would generally look like. And that's just to give you an idea of like, well, where would you put it? You know, a lot of times people think, well, where would you put the lot or the vault on my lot? So probably, you know, you could squeeze it into some parking, surface parking. A lot of times, if you've got structured parking, sometimes they'll put it underneath that. They'll put it, I think the Signet put it into a green space area. So the top of it is like a park area. And the idea here is just to help mitigate the flooding downstream. Obviously, you know, it's not going to completely solve the issue, but it will help a lot to hold that water for a couple of hours, let the storm pass, let the surge of flows go by, and then, you know, you're slowly releasing that amount. And so that's generally it. I guess if you have any questions or.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Katie. So questions about this and how to mitigate the issue, the rainwater in particular, stormwater in particular? Okay, Bill, I see your hand physically up. And
I get confused on which little buttons here you push. So.
All right, why don't you go first and then I'll go to Rich.
Yeah, well, no, I'm ready here.
Go ahead. Yeah, go first.
So, all right. So I'm not an expert in stormwater management planning and all that, but I think we can all assume that these on-site retention facilities are going to cost a bunch of money, depending on the size and so forth. We've had conversations about below grade parking and these, you know, replacing perhaps impervious, you know, at grade parking facilities. If we were to move away from so much on grade, at grade parking, try to provide some rooftop, you know, landscaping, absorption, you know, some of the creative stuff that's being discussed these days, how would that impact some of your projections on runoff and costs for some of these redevelopment plans?
I think that they definitely help. Like I said, a lot of times the BMP, the water quality BMPs are designed for smaller storms, but you know, it's a whole package. So if you can limit the amount of imperviousness that you're putting on the site by adding more green space, and incorporate the water quality BMPs that do have some capacity to store water and can be designed with that in mind. You know, it would definitely help. And I think on smaller sites, you may be able to just put those in to meet your, you know, to meet some of these 10-year storage requirements.
But
you
in
know, it could be
an
a give and a
urban,
take there.
yeah, in an urban area, I mean, with adjacent properties where all the runoff from our next door neighbor is part of the runoff that we get on our sites. I mean, these are all sort of interconnected. So I'm just trying to get an idea if there's some other mitigation measures that we can add to the package here to reduce generally the runoff and some of the stormwater challenges that you've identified here.
Well, I think definitely green, you know, adding more green space or open space helps. And I'll just say, you know, for Tyson's, I think they have a 1-inch retention requirement. So they add all of those water quality BMPs in, but most of the time they also have a vault in place, just because the sites are so small. I think when you have bigger sites, bigger sites may mean you have more impervious or more area to manage, but you also have more area to play around with.
Okay. Just inquiring here.
All right, Rich.
I have a couple of questions. Did the Signet stormwater management design, was it designed to comply with county-wide standards, or does it exceed county-wide standards?
Well, I come from the stormwater planning side, and I did not review it specifically for that. And maybe, I know Camelin is listening, but I think she's having a hard time responding. It was very hard to tell, you know, from my overall quick review of it, but it definitely complies with county standards. And I think it incorporated a lot of BMPs into the mix. So it may have exceeded its water quality requirements. I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
So the things that you were talking about here tonight, though, there are county-wide standards for stormwater management, right? Like if I have a piece of property somewhere and I want to develop it and it's not in a CBC or some other special zone, I hire a civil engineer and they tell me what my requirements are, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And is what you were talking about here in this slide, is that within the requirement or does it exceed the requirement?
It's really it's very site specific, but I think when you get into the 40 to 60 to 80% retention of the 10-year 2-hour storm in this area, you're probably exceeding it to some extent. So the county has water quality BMP requirements. So you have to meet a water quality standards. And then it also has a quantity control requirement, where you have to evaluate the existing conveyance system, generally up to, I think, the 10-year storm, in some cases higher if there's existing flooding directly downstream. So in this case, it's older stormwater infrastructure. So you can probably assume that the existing pipe system is not maybe adequate for the amount of flows coming to it currently. It doesn't meet our current stormwater standards. And in that case, you can either upgrade the system, which most people don't want to do because you're chasing it downstreams, or you can over detain on site. And that's what I mean when there are probably going to be some sort of detention requirements for the site. McLean is interesting in that, you know, and there are places like this throughout the county where it's, you know, it's completely paved now. So you have less of a requirement than you would if you were knocking down a forested area and your land cover was different. But in that case, that's kind of why we're looking for more in this case, because it's not new development and they don't have very strict standards stringent standards when your land cover is actually getting better. You know, you're going back to more open space rather than, you know, the total imperviousness that you see now. So there's not as strong as standards for quantity control in that case.
So I one more question before I make a comment then. When you have when you have a site that's mostly parking and less building and you put more building on it, theoretically the roof drains of the building are now collecting more water and putting it directly into a system, right?
I think it's about the same. So, you know, you'd look at where all that water is going, and if it's impervious in its current condition, and then it's generally impervious with the building on top of it, it's generally the same.
But roof drain water is not treated, correct?
Right.
And it's not retained, correct?
Right. So it's similar to a parking lot, right? It would act very similar.
Well, no, because in a parking lot, you retain the water and you treat it, right? If you build a new parking lot.
Right. Well, if you're building a new facility, yes. But like in these parking lots, no, there is no treatment. It's just running off.
Sure, but I'm saying if you build it, what we're interested in understanding is the impact on a new development, right? If I design a new project here and put a bigger building with parking areas, the surface parking areas get treated for quantity and quality, right? But the building roof does not.
Yes, it does.
Okay.
So when you're talking stormwater, all we care about is if they have 3 land cover categories. It's whether it's forested, open space or turf, or impervious cover. So whether building or parking lot, they're considered the same.
Okay. So, I mean, I think the point that I made last time, and I'd like to make again, is that, and Bill was kind of alluding to this a moment ago, is that there's a significant cost impact to stormwater management for a development project. And I understand the need to improve the existing condition, but if we're trying to encourage development, I don't think we can put a standard for the CBC that's higher than anywhere else in the county, because it represents a disincentive to developers to want to build in McLean if they have to build projects with stormwater management infrastructure that's higher than, say, if they were not in the CBC. And so all I'm suggesting is that we not have a higher standard, but just follow the standard.
Well, and I just want to add to your point, Rich, that I know in the district, they've instituted several green roof options, particularly for buildings north of Pennsylvania Avenue, where the runoff is just massive, that actually ends up flooding, into Southwest. The question to Rich's point, if you had a green roof, that absorbed a lot of this rainfall, wouldn't that be different in terms of treatment and cost?
Yes, green roofs can help, but I think developers find them to be fairly costly. So the idea with a vault, and this is a very typical, basically people move from dry ponds to vaults underground because you can utilize this space on top of it. So it doesn't take away any of your space. But green roofs can provide some storage as well.
Do current county-wide stormwater management regulations give credence to green roofs as effective stormwater management devices or not?
Yes. That's one of the practices.
So regardless of what their costs or everything, the county still recognizes them as legitimate stormwater management components if you choose to do.
Right. Yes.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting mandating them. I'm just suggesting it's an option that could, and I don't know the relative cost, but they could be an offset to some of the costs that and options that you've already described.
Right, but my understanding is that the language that's currently written into the plan requires a standard that exceeds the county standard. And that's the thing I have a problem, is that I feel like unless you're going to give a developer a incentive to exceed the standard, having something in the comp plan that requires the developer exceed the standard creates a disincentive to development, and that it basically acts as a restrictor, and it will not encourage development. In fact, discourage it, and we should not do anything that is discouraging development.
And I think the challenge with the CBC area is that there are documented existing flooding conditions downstream and, degraded streams. But I think the big focus is, there are neighborhoods that are really experiencing some challenges. So through the redevelopment process and through that rezoning process, it does give you the ability to at least ask for a little bit more to help address that. And it's kind of a give and a take, right? The county is trying to do what it can downstream, but you really need to see some of that upstream. And I think it's integrated into other comp plans as well, for other CBC areas to some extent. And one thing about the green roofs, just to clarify, they do provide some quantity control, but they're more of a quality type of practice. So they provide a lot of pollutant removal, and they can store the smaller storms, but it's harder to manage some of the larger ones. But they do, count on the overall package. They would definitely help.
All right, with that, any other questions? I think it would be, again, useful as Jack Wilburn, who has another event tonight, and I think he was going to try and flip back and forth between this and his other obligation, to figure out that language. And so, Rich, I know that you're involved in that and a handful of others. So, to see if we can't come up with something that does get to the balance that Katie has talked about, which is what we're striving for. So any other comments or questions on this topic as we move on then to land units?
Yeah, Kim, this is Joe Gorney again. Just a couple of points. I think one thing that Katie mentioned, I'd like to emphasize again, is the fact that since we have such a high level of imperviousness, again, you're not going from a forested condition to the existing county requirements. So you're going from a pretty high level. So anything is going to be an improvement, which is good. However, in some ways, I guess you're almost giving an advantage, and not necessarily, correct me if I'm wrong, Camlin, but you're not even necessarily going to be treating it to the same level as another place that's, say, outside of the McLean CBC. So we're a little concerned that level of treatment going from highly impervious, even if it's a slight reduction, you may not be providing enough to help mitigate some of that flooding perhaps that's happening downstream. The other thing that we get into when we do talk about the existing regulations is that there is an option for offsite mitigation. And our concern is that, with the offsite mitigation, that could be in a different watershed, such that there may be some improvement here and there within the greater county, but that doesn't mean that the people in the McLean area are going to see any benefit from that. So those are two kind of global issues that we see that we're concerned with. Now, having said that, I do take Rich's point very seriously, and I think one thing we only today started talking about it, but what are the incentives for doing a bit more than this? And from here, we would welcome the input from the task force is, okay, we're asking for something that makes sure that these requirements are met on site, one, and two, making sure that we're doing what is possible on site to help mitigate the downstream. But then what is the options for the developer of a particular site to maybe have some advantage for doing those things? And with that, we would certainly welcome what the task force may say to that. So the county has shown a great interest in this area. There's plenty of time and money and all of our tax money being spent in this area. And we want to make sure that those facilities maintain their integrity over time. That's certainly another concern. But please keep that in mind as we go forward. What might be that incentive for providing these on site, because providing on site is a fairly important sort of principle to ensure that the downstream efforts and the downstream improvements maintain their integrity over time. And with that, I'll just leave that.
All right, well, that's an excellent point and an excellent suggestion. So I guess I didn't realize the impact that the impervious surfaces and the CBC had downstream. And so to the extent as Katie was pointing out, that we've got some flooding and drainage issues and erosion issues as a result of that, then you're right. We need to address it, and we need to address it appropriately. So the question is, again, that balance, if we can do it in a way, and yeah, we're going to have to figure out perhaps another incentive or another way to encourage development, even with that requirement, because it is so important to the environment in the surrounding McLean area. So we certainly want to address those issues. So
yeah, and I guess the final point would be that the treatment shouldn't match what's being required of the developer. So if we're talking about the 2-hour storm is the big issue, and then the requirements say 24-hour storm, there may be a mismatch there. So we may not be meeting what McLean needs. So therefore that policy guidance may point people in the right direction. And I see that Camlin has joined us as well. So
yes, Joe, I mean, I guess obviously the thing is, we all need to consider, well, where do we actually put the water? And I guess, you have to put it somewhere. And I guess an area that's redeveloping, one of the things that allows an area to redevelop is that you have infrastructure. When you have an older area that's redeveloping, obviously you need roads, but you also need stormwater management. You need the conveyance system to take the water away from those areas so that it doesn't actually flood on the local site. So I guess you either have to take the water away or you have to keep it, otherwise it's going to flood something. And so, in thinking about the whole package here and the concept of keeping water on site, if you don't keep the water on site, then there's probably going to have to be something done to the infrastructure to take the water away. And somebody has to pay for it. Either it gets paid for by, keeping the water on site for storage, or it gets paid for through taxes in order to upgrade the infrastructure to take the water away. And that obviously has other impacts, as we know, downstream erosion and flooding on somebody else's piece of property. So I think it's we have to do something with the water.
Yeah, but you guys are kind of using all of these technical terms to, frankly, I'm getting a little confused, because the likely, in all these meetings we talk about having sidewalk improvements and streetscape improvements and buildings that aren't too tall and stormwater management improvements. And basically what we're going to end up with is nothing. We're going to end up with parking lots and existing buildings, and you're not going to improve any stormwater management or anything, because we're going to make it so expensive and impossible for a developer to do anything that nothing is going to happen. And I think you guys really need to start weighing the potential benefits of redevelopment versus the status quo, and that we have to stop laying over top of new development all of these requirements that are going to make it impossible for anybody to do anything.
Some of the requirements we have no control over. Obviously, when you redevelop, regardless, you're going to have to address a certain percentage of that, regardless of the fact there wasn't any water quality measures there in the past. You're going to have to do that. That's a state requirement. That's absolutely unavoidable.
Right, but that's why we're saying, are we setting up language that requires you to meet the standard for development, or are we exceeding it? And that's the part I don't quite understand.
As I said, obviously you have to to do a certain amount for the state requirements, and obviously that transfers down to the county requirements. Now, the balance of the question here is, in order to prevent the flooding, which causes a huge cost impact when that happens, you have a choice of how you manage the water. You either take it away, and if you take it away, that costs money to take it away, and then transfers down to somebody else, and we have to provide or address the issue there of how to manage the water, and that has a cost too. Or you can keep some of the water and not have to upgrade the infrastructure all the way downstream, and not have to address it in such a big way on downstream properties to prevent the erosion and the flooding on those properties. And I think what we want to do, I think everybody's on the same page, what we want to do is bring the overall cost of doing this down.
Right. Okay. And with that, I'm going to move on. I do think that again, the subcommittee or whatever that has agreed to meet, and again, Jack Wilburn is leading that effort. He has already reached out to a number of folks, and a number of folks have reached out to him. If you are interested in joining that effort, contact Jack. We'll be coordinating with the county staff to follow up and to get further details. Yes, Rashan.
Thank you, Kim. I had a question about water retention. Are these standards applying to new residential developments as well, depending on the size of the lot? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Katie, or yes.
Is that directed to
Anyone?
Yes, anyone.
Obviously, there are exemptions for pieces of property, residential property, small developments within the regulations. Obviously, when you have lots of property which is all residential like that, the cumulative impact actually comes back to the same thing. And I guess, generally speaking, I think there's going to be a county-wide policy through necessity that residential lots, regardless of size, are going to have to do something to take care of their share of the water. We simply have so much flooding that we just can't deal with it. People are having flooding in their homes, and it's just destroying people's lives.
Yes, of course, I understand that. It's just transferring the cost of mitigation of too much water is being transferred to homeowners or to developers, whether it's through new construction or whether the older construction is through flood insurance and other means. Is that correct? There has to be a balance between what the county is doing and what the individuals or developers are doing.
Well, I mean, the county really is the community. The money the county spends on solving these problems, it comes from the people that live and work in the county. That's where the money comes from. Everybody's paying.
Yes.
And flood insurance, that is the same thing. That everybody's paying. It's just, I guess, shared. But the cheapest solution is avoidance of the flooding, because the cost of cleanup is really not good. It's extremely high, and it just destroys lives. And so that's why we prevention instead of cure, if you like, or after the fact.
All right, Rob, I see you have your hand up.
Very, very quickly, we've sort of sized this replanning of the CBC to be significantly larger than the consultant suggested. Is that provide an incentive? The fact that you're probably getting to build bigger than maybe the consultant, the county, and some of the residents think, is that an incentive to pay for some of this? Because we're letting more people develop bigger than I think it was the original thought. Now, I'm not saying that's an absolute. I'm just throwing it out as a factor we ought to look at.
All right. Okay, and with that, thank you, Joe, to you and your colleagues. And Jack and his team will be back in touch with you, working on hopefully some language that you can share for our review in September at that meeting.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. And with that, we'll go Jen, who is going to do this presentation on behalf of the county.
I actually am going to turn it over to David, who has the presentation up now. He'll be walking the task force through that information.
All right. Thanks, David.
Thank
All right, guys. For the land use discussion, we're going to start with a map of the existing sub areas and proposed land units. Currently, the comprehensive plan includes 29 sub areas, as shown here on the left, and the draft plan text map on the right of the proposed land units proposes to reduce the amount of sub areas to 12 land units. The 12 land units proposed in the draft plan text are organized by zones that were developed during the vision plan in 2018. As most of you know, this is when the concept of the center, general, and edge zone was developed. So basically, land units C1 and C2 are located in the center zone. Land units G1 through G4 are located in the general zone, and E1 through E6 are located in the edge zone. The center zone was divided into 2 land units to depict the area eligible for the bonus height area, as well as the area that does not qualify for the bonus height area. So the land units were a logical way to organize the base recommendation. It generally combines smaller land units into larger ones. For example, former subunits 4, 23, and 24, as you can see on the map here on the left, were combined into land unit E1, shown here on the map on the right. Additionally, the zones created during the visioning process also shaped the organization of the land units in the draft plan text. Here's another example. Land units 27 and 28, right here on the left, formed land units G4, E6, and G3 here on the right. And because land units E6, which is located in the edge zone, bifurcates land units G3 and G4 in the general zone, it was logical for us to create separate land units for G3 and G4. And since they are not geographically contiguous. So this is one reason why we had to create 4 separate land units in the general zone, is because, again, they're not geographically contiguous. Additionally, the proposed land units also reflect the zones developed.
David, can I ask a question on that one? So couldn't you just say the same rules that apply to G3 also apply to G4 and just call them both G3?
I think it will be confusing for the reader and of the map, because again, they're not contiguous.
Right, but I mean the same restrictions and possibilities exist and aren't they similar in both sections? For example, I mean, just picking that one out, for example. So I'm thinking of only in terms of how many different unique unit groups or units we need. Is it not for ease of purpose and saying in this section, while they're not contiguous, you can do the following 10 things and you can't do the following 5 things in the G3 section? Is that not accomplishing the same thing but eliminating another land unit?
Well, it is true G3 and G4, do have the same, recommendations under the form-based plan.
Yeah.
But, there's also another consideration is the base plan, which has, has the, again, the base plan recommendations are organized by a land unit. I think it's just easier for the reader to have separate land units. I don't know if Leanna or Jen.
Can we have a couple of slides coming up? Part of the reason for this organization was to capture base plan recommendations. So they're not necessarily all the same in the existing sub units. And I think we've got, it might start on the next slide, an explanation of how we brought forward the existing base plan recommendations in the new text, that we weren't making changes to existing base recommendations. And then we can go over kind of the methodology for that. If that makes sense. You're right that the optional development in the general zone would be the same under our new form-based plan.
All right, thanks. I'll go ahead and continue. Sorry, Dave.
Sure. Okay, and I just wanted to let the task force know this chart depicts the sub-area components of the land units, and this will be posted on the McLean CBC website tomorrow if anyone that would like to examine this topic further. This topic was also on the cover of set 2 of the draft plan text. All right, now moving on to the base plan. The base plan is basically described as a general land use designation, which provides guidance for the use and intensity. The base plan often reflects the existing uses and is often used for the review of special exceptions and special permit applications. In the case of the draft plan text for the McLean CBC, the new base plan recommendations carry forward the existing base plan recommendations currently found in the existing comprehensive plan for the McLean CBC. Now, the optional level of development in the comprehensive plan provides guidance for additional uses and higher intensities than is recommended by the base plan. It often includes development conditions such as consolidation requirements, streetscape improvements, and public amenities. And in the case of the draft plan text for the vision plan for the McLean CBC, the option is basically is recommended as the development of the form-based plan. Well, in the center and general zone, for example, the optional level of development is the form-based plan. And next, if there's no questions, we're going to move to the methodology of the base plan. As stated previously, the base plan recommendation and the draft plan text carry forward the current sub-area based recommendations from the existing comprehensive plan. However, some of the existing McLean CBC recommendations do not include a intensity or density. So in these cases, the intensity of the existing development was used for the draft base plan. It also should be noted that during the development of the new base plan, the intensity of the existing development in the McLean CBC was calculated. And during this process, it was discovered that some parcels were developed at a higher intensity than that was recommended by the existing base plan today. So in these cases, the new base plan uses the intensity of the existing development to determine the intensity. It should also be noted that when the intensity of the existing development was used to form the new base plan for a particular area, an average intensity was calculated. The next slide provides an overview of additional land unit considerations. First, the current comprehensive plan text is not being carried forward under the new form-based plan, as the uses and intensities that are allowed by the existing options in the McLean CBC today are possible under the new form-based plan. The draft text also includes additional guidance to address considerations related to height or compatibility for particular land units. this guidance addresses transition. An example of this guidance is addressing transitions between zones and areas outside of the boundaries of the CBC, which is an issue that the task force has been discussing a great deal. Additionally, finally, I just want to let the task force know that staff is also developing additional text to better describe the base plan methodology and also better text to help interpret its implementation. Next, I'm going to review some examples of how the new base plan was developed. I want to let the task force know that the page and line numbers at the top of the slides I'm about to show you indicate where in the second set of draft plan text the recommendations I am providing as an example can be found. The first slide is an example of an existing base plan that is carried forward, and the floor area ratio of the existing development was consistent with the recommendations. So, and I also want to let the task force know that the area in blue is the area that is being described by, that's described by the slide. So in this case, we have the area in blue in land unit C1, which applies to areas highlighted in blue, and this area is located at the corner of Chambridge Road, Old Dominion Drive, Beverly Road, and land unit C2. So the existing base level for this area and the existing comp plan recommendation is neighborhood serving retail and supplemental office at an intensity of 0.35 FAR. And currently this area is developed with retail and some office uses at an average intensity of 0.32 FAR. So, and also it has this area has an existing option, which is retail with office at a 0.5 FAR. The base plan carries forward the existing recommendation, which is neighborhoods serving retail and office at an intensity of 0.35 FAR, since the existing development that's there today fits in those parameters. And then the new option in the vision plan allows a mix of uses with a maximum height of 7 stories. And since this area is eligible for the bonus height recommendation, it can achieve a height up to 10 stories if it consolidates. So basically, the new option allows a greater flexibility of uses and intensity than the existing option. So it makes it unnecessary to carry forward the current option of a 0.5 FAR. The next slide provides an example of an area within the base plan that did not provide an intensity. Some of the existing land unit recommendations in the existing plan today do not have a base plan recommendation. So this area is a triangular area bounded by Old Dominion Drive, Beverly Road, and Elm Street, highlighted in blue. And like I said, in this case, existing base plan recommended office over ground floor retail with no intensity, no FAR was given. And the existing development in this area consists of retail averaging at 0.45 floor area ratio. So in this case, the existing intensity of a 0.45 FAR was carried forward and became the new intensity for the base plan. And like the other example, the new option for this is a mix of uses with a maximum height of 7 stories, and this area is also eligible for the bonus height. So again, like the previous example, the existing option was not carried forward, as the new option for this area offers greater flexibility and intensity than the existing option. And then I'll just provide one more example, and this final example is the area located in land unit C2 between Beverly Road, Old Chainbridge Road, and south of Fleetwood Drive. In this case, the existing base plan recommends retail and office at a intensity of 0.35 FAR. The existing development in this area includes office and self-storage at an average intensity of a 1.0 FAR. So again, the new base plan for this area takes into account the existing FAR and proposes office and retail uses up to 1.0 FAR. And again, the new option for this is this is in C2, so it's a maximum height of 7 stories. So like the other examples, there's no need to carry the option forward because the form-based plan allows more flexibility in terms of intensity and uses. So does anyone have any questions?
Okay, Rich.
So I don't understand the whole idea behind having a base plan recommendation and a optional level of development.
Right. Well, the base basically reflects the existing uses. So if someone wants to make a change to, let's say there's an office building and someone wants to convert maybe some space on the first floor to retail. So they just want to make a minor change through a special exception or special permit, then that's where that base plan comes into play. Now, if someone wants to completely redevelop the site to up to the, say, 7 stories, then they would use the option. But, you know, again, we need the base plan in case someone wants to make a minor change.
And that's why you have to have all these different little areas. So we can't achieve our goal, which is to not have so many sub areas. Because when I look at this, I basically see, you know, when I'm looking at page, you know, you talked about page 32, you know, going up to line 912. But for C1, if you go to page 33, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 additional base plan areas. So essentially, this C1 is actually made up of 5 subzones. And this seems equally, if not more complex than what we have now. So can you tell me why it isn't?
I think, well, the reason we have so many zones like in C1, for example, because there are a lot of different intensities within C1. So there are a lot of intensities in terms of the existing development. So, I mean, what the base plan, like I've said before, it's basically, it just reflects what's there today, the existing development. So in case someone, say, on a 0.5 office building, a 0.5 FAR wants to make a change without redeveloping the site, they need this base plan for things like special exceptions, special permits.
Rich, you are right that when, you know, in the evaluation of the 29 this is Leanna, the 29 sub areas, you know, we have these different scenarios where it's not as straightforward, I think, as we would have liked to be able to say, okay, this one entire area has a base plan of a 0.35. Let's leave it at that. You know, it can be 0.35 for the center zone as a base plan. And David kind of went through the 3 situations that we have. We have one where there's a clear base plan now for that sub area. We have situations where it's not clear in some of our subunits. You know, it kind of just says office and retail without an intensity calculation. And then we went back and looked to see what had occurred on the ground. Part of the effort is to check the existing base plan against what has been built, so that in the future, if someone were to come in and say to convert, you know, a bank to a restaurant, they come in for a review. We don't want someone to then not be in conformance with the plan. So you know, we want to what we're trying to do is balance being clear what the current base plan is for a situation like that, whereas trying not to be overly complicated. I think, you know, by mapping these, one thought we had was to map the areas in C1, for example, like David went through some of those examples, and then perhaps use a chart to show what the existing base plans are for those particular areas. So it's not quite so much text to help reflect what the base plan is. But we hear you about, you know, C1 being divided into these different areas. It's just that there's not one there's not one base plan recommendation for these. And you know, the attempt that we made was to, you know, we went from 29 to 12. 29 is a lot of sub areas, and they're all, you know, have varying levels of specificity in their recommendations. So to try to have a logical grouping of those, at least based on the vision plan zones, is sort of the approach that we took.
Right, but like I said, basically land unit C1 from a base plan standpoint is basically made up of 5 different areas, right?
Right, and one approach, you know, we've heard this feedback from you all through task force members and Kim and others, and one approach we thought we could look at was maybe we summarize it as a range and clarify that, you know, so for example, C1, the base plan ranges from 0.35 to a 0.5, and then clarify if someone were to come in for a review for like a special exception or special permit, we're going to use your existing intensity. We're not up planning someone inadvertently in their base plan. That's what we would want to be careful of too.
I mean, I think, I'm an architect and I know how to read drawings and maps. And honestly, I find the language and the graphical presentation to be nearly incomprehensible. Because like when I look at C1, for example, and then I go and look at the text that's on page 33, it's all, you know, the property descriptions are all done using words. And I can't even tell what you're talking about in C1
David,
as far as
can you flip to the
subareas go.
Yeah, and so since we've drafted the text, we've gone back to map those. And so one idea, and we'd welcome the task force's feedback on it, is to use these maps instead, and to you know, we would have more of an introduction to the base plan and what it means, and what it means if you come in for a special exception, special permit, and then they would be, can you go to the one, David, towards the end that shows C1 and how we might map it with a chart at the end?
I mean, like which description in page 33 is the Ashby, for example? I can't even tell.
Mm-hmm. So this is one idea. This is
right. So this gets
on C1.
Right. So this is graphically showing the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sub areas of C1. And so now you're going to do this for every single sub area. So we're going to end up with maybe more sub areas than we had before. If C1 has 6, then you break all of these down. How many do we end up having? I mean, is it basically the same?
50.
I haven't counted. I don't know that we have quite as many. C1 is an example of where we have quite a few, I think. But this is an idea, and we haven't. This is draft language, but you know, for example, if we said the base plan for C1 ranges from a 0.35 to a 0.6, so we're just generalizing that even more, and then if the reader needs to know what the specific base plan is in a sub-geography of this, then you could find that also in a table.
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense, because when I see this, it's more comprehensible. And under the C1 section, there was a heading for part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4, part 5, part 6 with the base area recommendation. Then I can graphically look at where it is and read what the base recommendation is for it, so that we can at least understand for each parcel what's going on. You're saying that the base plan recommendation is basically what the existing condition is?
Generally it is, yes, the existing condition.
So like the Ashby property only has a 0.4 FAR? Because that's the implication from parcel 1, right? Is that there is a base plan recommendation of 0.4, but does the Ashby currently fit that?
Right
the
here.
Ashby is in C2. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I see. Sorry. Okay. Reading the wrong. Okay. Gotcha. Never mind.
It's just to pipe in here. The Ashby is one of those examples to which Leanna referred, in which there is no base plan intensity given. So there is some, it just says eastern portion of the sub area for residential uses.
Right, but C2 is going to be broken down into a bunch of zones as well, right?
Mhm.
And how many
Yeah.
how many zones is C2?
Why don't we just have two maps, a base plan map and an options map?
Well, I think the way this works is good because at least you get to see within each major zone what the subzones are, right? So you can put them together.
But you don't need to put them together because you've got a separate situation. If you want to do something under the base plan, you look at the base plan map and you look at the language, and that's what you do. If you want to build optionally, you look at the other map, and you don't need so many little zones.
Yeah, you're probably right now that you say it that way.
Yes, that's something we could look at. I would note that the other piece of information that we've included in the draft land units are any special considerations for the optional development. So if we were to organize it as how Rob suggested, we would have a map of the CBC, numbered, and we'd sort of highlight the different base plan ranges, and then we could look at where we might include any additional recommendations we had for optional development. For example, I know we're talking about particular areas where we might have language about paying particular attention to transitions. If you're right up against an area that's outside of the CBC, that's where it's currently housed. Language like that, for example, that might apply to only one land unit. Or right now we have additional language for the zone that abuts the school. So I think we have language that says, pay particular attention to height and transitions here. So I understand the approach. Like if we had a base plan map with just the base plan, we would just need to think about where we might put those recommendations, and maybe they belong under each zone. I don't want to have a. I think we are all in agreement that we want to try to have a plan that doesn't just read like a list of exceptions to the new vision.
Right, but if I count up using the current text that we have for part 2, there are 30 sub areas in the base plan. So we're actually going to at least that. So we're going to end up with more sub areas in the base plan than we currently. If I counted correctly from the text. And I'm not even sure the base plan text reflects what you're showing here, because in the language, I think for C1, you only had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 paragraphs for C1, but you're showing 6 zones. So I guess some of them are combined.
Yeah, one is the introductory paragraph.
But it's going to be at least 30 subzones for base text, base plan. I mean, I don't know, what does everybody else think about having a base plan that has more sub areas than
I think that there are compelling interests to retaining a base plan. Those are ensuring that any minor modification, including but not limited to special permits and special exceptions, will not become incompatible with the new comprehensive plan. That is a very compelling thing, that we absolutely cannot have somebody trying to put an awning on a building not being able to pass site plan review because they're all of a sudden no longer in compliance with the comprehensive plan. The other issue is there are some special considerations and there are some development options that should still be retained in the edge zone. And there are special considerations that the community 20 years ago, negotiated into being part of this plan. So there are interests on both the developer and the public side that I think really need to be honored. I think I don't have a huge problem with what staff's done here. I have a problem with how they have done it. They are aware of my concerns. So I'm happy to work with them where there are still outstanding issues, but I think it's absolutely critical that we retain some sort of base plan so that landowners can reposition their property, implement revitalization efforts short of a full-scale redevelopment. And frankly, this is why we're concerned about the interim development conditions language being too overly having that net cast overly wide to include some of these things and force them to come up to the form-based vision when they're really just trying to make revitalizations and enhancements. So again,
I get what you're saying, Paul, but why is it so finely balkanized? I mean, looking at this chart alone, you have a zone with a 0.4, a 0.45, a 0.35, a 0.5, and a 0.6.
Because the current plan is balkanized like this.
Yeah.
The current
why can't this be corrected to have a little bit more smoothness to it instead of having 0.35 versus 0.4 versus 0.45? I mean, it is so like.
Well, I won't warrant that these numbers are accurate, but generally it's so balkanized because the current plan is so balkanized. I mean, if you look at the eastern section of C2, that literally has like different development options, different redevelopment areas. I mean, it's a few acres, but it's 5 different potential plant development options. So, you know, to answer your question, Rich, you've asked a few times, if you overlay the land units on top of the sub areas, you have something like 49 different new sub units. Again, sounds crazy, but I'm totally fine with, because we have committed to the public, to the landowners, that the adopted plan recommendations, site specific at least, would remain as options. So I think we should do whatever it takes to do it well. And I think the concern about sort of blending it is that you're giving certain property owners potentially, as apparently what was proposed to us by David would do, certain properties at the far north end are now going to have a 1.0 as opposed to a 0.35 base FAR. So again, there's inconsistencies in how this language has been interpreted, but I'll leave it there.
So can I ask a question here? I'm a bit confused by the wording here on the base recommendations. So all of this in the blue are for office and retail, and none of it is residential?
Correct.
Yes, this captures the base plan, the current plan today, before a plan amendment. You know, the only places that residential use is planned is where you see those site-specific recommendations, like where Signet is and the benchmark approval.
Okay,
that's correct.
so we're essentially, as I'm looking at this, and now the way you have it explained to me, we're not going to get any of the density that we've talked about needing to create a vibrant community, except maybe lunch hour.
No, this is the base plan. So this is reflecting the existing base recommendations, which generally reflects existing development and intensities. The vision that we've talked about to introduce new uses and at higher intensities are all captured under the optional level of development. So we have our sections that you all have reviewed that explain what can happen in each zone.
Right. But I guess that's my second question. So this reflects the base plan, and as we know, our current base plan does not encourage any residential in the downtown CPC. So if that reflects the base plan, then I understand that. But then does it say that you've got to go then get the special exemption or the special rule then to build the high density building that we believe we need to create a vibrant downtown? And then is that not sort of back to where we were, which is, again, you've got to go to a double ask of the community, a double ask of Fairfax County staff to do essentially what we've been trying to accomplish here, which is something that's a little bit more streamlined. And the vision is a vibrant downtown that includes density housing. And so this document has really thrown me off. So,
what you're describing is captured as the optional level of development. So if someone were to consolidate property or not and come forward and say, I want to build a 7-story building in the center zone, you know, and here's my proposal, they would need to come in for a rezoning. And then that would be reviewed against the plan recommendations that are under our optional level of development. And we would look at, you know, all of the things that we've talked about, you know, the provisions for open space, the streetscapes, you know, all of that.
right.
This is simply capturing what exists today in the comp plan at the base level, the existing development, and how that is used is if someone were to come in, not for a rezoning, to go to a completely different zoning category, but it would be used, for example, if someone were to convert a bank to a restaurant, or like Paul mentioned, you know, some minor change. You know, what would happen is that our department looks at if it's in harmony with the comprehensive plan. So if we had our concern is that if we had no guidance about a base level, you know, if someone came in for something very minor like that, the plan would say, okay, you can do this form-based plan and you can get up to 7 stories and you have to do X, Y, and Z. And those are different expectations than maybe what would come from a smaller development that could occur under the base plan, if that makes sense. So
I get that part. So I guess, so walk me through, if I am the owner of the Langley Shopping Center and I have decided to consolidate space and get my 4 to 6 acres, and that's where we're going to have our new open space and the housing I want, and I'm going to have my 10-story buildings there. And so I see here that it's under office and retail intensity of 0.4 FAR. So obviously we don't have the FAR now. We're going to form-based. So walk me through the process then of the developers who walk in with that concept, so I have a better appreciation.
So they would come in and they would say, we have this property and we'd like to build a mix of uses at, you know, X height. And we would go to our new plan, the new vision that's under the form-based plan, and we would say, okay, how many dwelling units do you have? You know, what's your non-residential square footage? And you know, we've got kind of our caps, so we would make sure that that's met. And then we would look at our design guidance that we've talked about in terms of the height maximums that we've looked at. We would look at the open space. You know, if this is in an area that you can get up to 10 stories, we would look at that in terms of the open space, park space being provided. And then we look at the streetscape guidance to see if that's being met. So the base plan wouldn't come into play in that case at all.
But they wouldn't have to go in and do the double hit with the community, double hit with the county for a special exemption that is included now. It's not the base plan, it's the new, it
would be a rezoning, which would fall under the new plan that we've been working on. So we would, you know, the base plan there wouldn't come into play. We would look at the new guidance.
Okay, so the base plan is really only in play when you're doing minor improvements.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Okay, thank you.
I did want to clarify that for the edge zone, we are bringing forward any options that would exist in the edge, because the edge zone, we were bringing forward comprehensive plan recommendations as they are. Just want to clarify that. I think somebody asked that question.
Thank you, Leanna.
All right, let's talk for a moment to, and David, if you would address this about the area we talked about with Jim Peoples on Holmes Place, and why you think that we ought to stick with the original language and our new sub areas.
Right. As you can see the slide, the task force voted last time to create a 75-foot buffer on the southern and western portion of the Balducci Shopping Center, or I think it's called McLean Square. And this red, so basically the proposal was to bifurcate this parcel and put this area on the other side of this red line into the edge zone. And as you can see, I don't know if you guys can see, but here's the building footprint of the Balducci's store, and then this is the other retail development on the south side of the shopping center. Basically, so if this were to be bifurcated, this is kind of, this area south of this line would become part of the edge zone, and this area would remain in the green zone, or in the general zone. And if that were to happen to, since with like what was stated previously, in the edge zone, we're bringing forward the existing plan recommendations in the edge zone. We're not changing the recommendations in the edge zone. So if we're to do this, then this portion right now is, this area is classified as retail and office up to 0.5 FAR. So that area wouldn't be eligible for the form-based plan. It would just be eligible again for retail and office up to 0.5 FAR, while the remainder of the parcel would be eligible for up to 5 stories and a mix of uses.
And what are we asking here, or what are we saying? Are you asking us to say this is good or not good, or I'm confused what we're?
I think this is a kind of just a question for you all, if that was the intent. And we just wanted to first ask that and explain why we had the question, because the edge zone is remaining as currently planned and so by removing a section of this site from the general zone, that would mean that you're taking a portion of the site out of the area that's that would be eligible for the form-based flexible plan. And if that was the intent here. So that was the question. And I'll give you an example of how we were thinking this through. If someone were to come in to redevelop this property and was looking at providing residential use, maybe on the edge, to have a compatible use transition, to the adjacent homes outside of the CBC and Holmes Place, and also to the townhomes. Right now, the current plan for this site does not recommend residential use. So, so here we are right at the edge, and that's where we kind of wondered if that was the intent. This sliver here would remain planned for the retail and office at a 0.5, separate from the rest of this property, which would be eligible for the form-based plan and the mix of uses, which would include residential. And it's really just a question to make sure we understand the intent. And if the concern, and I know Jim wasn't available to join us tonight. I know David's spoken to him a couple of times, but if the intent, or if the concern, is height or appropriate transitions, then perhaps there's a way to get at that with additional guidance if the task force intent wasn't to remove a section of this property from the general zone, if that makes sense, and the option for redevelopment.
I think we wanted to be responsive to Jim's concern about, being across the street from single detached homes and not wanting 5-story building right across the street. And I think from my conversation with you all, you were saying that you felt you could address it perhaps better and cleaner without that new whatever 70-foot, 75-foot, whatever buffer that we put in. So I think that was just whether or not you felt that was a cleaner way to take care of Jim's concerns, or this way is the cleaner way to deal with it.
Well, I also had a concern about this area, which I have from the beginning. And I've repeatedly voiced concerns about having a general zone property directly adjacent to single family homes. And so I agree with Jim about what these problems are. And I think the conundrum we've continually had is that the structure of the 3-zone process creates problems in areas like this. And now what I see coming up is that there's going to be another little unique sub area created just for this property if we can't figure out a way to make the 3-zone process work. Because I mean, I understand what you're saying about residential, but why can't you write the base plan language to allow 2-story, residential or something up against homes? Because the idea is to discourage 5-story buildings within this zone. And everybody knows that's what the deal is. So it's not a question.
I think how we would propose to handle that, if everyone wanted to keep the option for residential here, was to say something like that. The area, the edge of this the edge of this property, this zone should be no higher than 2 stories, and we have something like that there to get at the concern. I understand the concern. This is, I think, one of the couple areas where we have a general zone abutting the edge of the CBC.
Right, because the way this, in my view, what this diagram promotes is the idea of keeping the office building that's next to the words Holmes Place and tearing down the shopping center and building a 5-story building where the parking lot and the Balducci's is away from the homes, and creating some sort of buffer zone in the 75-foot area in return for being allowed to build a 5-story building on the north end of the property away from the houses. And that I think is what Jim and I were trying to achieve with protecting the edge, is to not preclude the redevelopment of Balducci's shopping center, but to make it clear that there's a low build zone that has to happen along the west and south, and that needs to be explicit.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how you do that, but I think that was the intent. And without specific language for the G1 parcel, we saw no other way of doing it other than to create a slice of edge zone within there.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I guess the question I would have is whether or not, you could see townhomes built along that street, along the edge, which would fit in nicely with the existing houses along that one stretch, and fit in nicely with the development there, and then build everything else. If it becomes an edge zone, we would encourage no development.
May I say something? I mean, at any division of parcels, yes, you can hear me. Any division of parcels at any time is gonna have a residential next to a commercial, or 2 different zones next to each other. And we continue to keep doing this to protect the neighborhoods with single family homes. But if you protect this 75-feet zone, there's still gonna be a commercial area next to a residential area. So we have to find a way to, whether it's planting or whatever is written in the comp plan, that should be automatic, that there would be a buffer of trees or something that would protect the residential areas. I mean, I think we are going overboard wanting to protect the residential areas where that is already pretty much understood, that nobody wants to build a 5 or 7-story building across the street from single family homes.
Yeah, but Rashawn, if it's not embodied in the code, then there's nothing stopping someone from doing it. I mean, the simple fact is you can do it.
But what are you achieving by with this line? Because then across from this line again, there's going to be a G1.
Right, but at least you have the ability to create a low build zone where it follows edge zone density, which as you can see is 0.5. So that's like 2-story buildings as opposed to 5-story.
I think it would be better if we could achieve that purpose by planning the general zone in a way that does not really interfere necessarily too much with the residential. I don't really see how we achieve much by continuing to cut down on the areas for development.
So right now in our draft for this land unit, we have language that says the southeastern portion of land unit D1 abuts the edge of the CBC. I'm only going to read you 2 sentences. And is planned as a transition from the general zone immediately to residential uses outside of the CBC, as there is no abutting edge zone in this location. Transitions between any new development and the existing uses outside of the CBC should be carefully designed, particularly as related to height. Now, this draft doesn't say, is not currently limiting it to 2 stories, but our thought there was, here's an example. It's on page 37 of the draft. Here's an example of where we're trying to call out an area that is special in that it's a general zone against the edge of the CBC. And here's an area where you need to pay particular attention to those transitions. I mean, certainly if the task force would like to look at more specific language about those transitions, we can take a look at that. But
I know if I were the owner of the property, I would be very interested in specific recommendations, because using fluffy terms like transition and sensitive can mean different things to you versus what it might mean to me, or what it might mean to my neighbor who owns the property. Their idea of a sensitive transition might be nothing. And if we all recall, one of the goals we've been trying to do here is to make things more understandable and more certain, so that we reduce community strife over redevelopment by making sure that that the playing field is more clearly defined, so that everything is not a negotiation. Because that's what we heard from the developers, was that there's so much uncertainty around a lot of this language that they don't want to touch it, because they just don't know what they're getting into.
Well, this is Derek speaking. Is there a way to make it more explicit, just to say that within 75 feet of a residential zone, in the general zone, you can't go more than 2 stories? Can we be explicit?
I would say, is it 2 stories? Is it 3 stories? You have a lot of 3-story, how tall are the
3
townhouses?
stories then. Whatever's the number, rather than saying being sensitive transition, be more.
Right. Be explicit.
And leave it in the general zone, but just be explicit within 75 feet of a residential zone. It can't be more than 3 stories, something like that. Is that possible?
certainly, I mean, there's we have guidance about each zone, and then we also have guidance if you all would like to have that guidance in any place where we abut a residential area, where general zone does, or if this is the issue, if this site is the issue, it could be located there. I'd have to look. We'd have to look at the. We'd have to look at the map to see where else, how many other places that would be impacted by the 75 feet. We could certainly highlight that for everyone.
I think that would be a good idea. I do think, I think that would probably make it cleaner and easier to just do it as Derek has suggested. And if you would look at, because that's the intent. We do want to protect these homes from being across the street directly from a 5-story building. But if you would look at the map and see what other areas then this language would impact, so we can look at that as we head into our next meeting.
I mean, it's going to impact a lot. I mean, it's going to impact all of G1, where Ingleside Avenue is, and parts of Whittier Avenue, and parts of Old Dominion Drive, and Bruckner Street, and Calder Road. I mean, it's going to. I'm be shocked at how many parcels that affects.
I mean, so then it might be that we want it specific to this section. I mean, it's one of these things too. I think one of the benefits of living in CBC. And when I first moved to McLean, I lived in a townhouse in McLean Mews. I lived in the CBC. I lived there intentionally so I could walk to places, having come from Capitol Hill and trying to get used to suburbia. So I wanted to be in the heart of town. And I don't think if that's not attractive to you, that you move to a place right next to downtown. So, we've got a lot of background noise here. But that said, we need to be mindful of it. We don't want to add this language and have an unintentional consequence. So, but if so, the intent is definitely for this section. And then if we could take a look at what other sections that would impact. But I think your point is absolutely right with Ingleside and others. And yet that is in the center zone, not just the general zone, but the center zone where there's going to be, in theory anyway, a taller building.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to be, I'm looking at the map right now. It's like, wow, you're going to really be opening Pandora's box.
I think what we did with the draft was we added more specific language, and we'll look at even more specific language where the general zone abutted the edge of the CBC without an edge zone, if that makes sense. Because most of the general zone areas have an edge zone as the step down before you get to the end of the edge of the CBC, if that makes sense. But this is unique in that we don't have that as a transition.
Yes, it's actually the only polling sector in the whole CBC if you don't count the north.
The Dolly Madison,
Madison, which I don't think you can count Dolly Madison.
Okay. Right. Thank you, Liana. But may I also say, Kim, I know just briefly that these residential homes adjacent to commercial property lines, they have always been there. And it used to be that they're valued considerably less. Nowadays, it's changing. In fact, if you're near a town center, they're valued more because more and more people want to be near town. So it's not an unknown process that we constantly need to be protected.
I would agree. I mean, it's back to my point about living in McLean Mews. I loved it. Yeah. Okay, Rob, did you have a comment?
I would just say, if height needs to be considered, and I think looking at the whole map is good, because again, while you're eliminating this two-step process, having chaired the Planning and Zoning Committee for about 2.5, 3 years, if you get this height, you're going to have the neighbors in, and you're going to have a protracted rezoning process. And I think it's better to sit and say, be sensitive to the transition up front, because you're only fooling yourself. You're going to take what could be a 2-month case and turn it into a 1.5-year case, because you're going to have neighborhood opposition to 5-story buildings across from single-family homes or townhouses. I mean, that's what happens. And, if we're trying to give the developers a clear signal, that's a clear signal, is that when you're in a transition area, you can't do what you can do if you're not in a transition area. In the long run, they'll probably save money.
Right. You're totally right.
All right. Paul, you have questions?
Yeah, I just want just a couple facts here. We have 4-story townhouses as it stands within the CBC. We have 4-story office buildings directly across the street from single-family homes. So I want to be very clear that we should be careful about what we're trying to do here with potential general zone redevelopments and keep it focused on this particular salient area. To that end, I would agree with Leanna's suggested course of action, which is to keep this within the general zone and apply site-specific language that deals with this as essentially a one-off situation. If you move it into edge, it's going to make the entire parcel unworkable. And we have, frankly, an opportunity to connect it with parkland and to do something nice for the community here. And frankly, making that edge just, again, precludes development. So.
Thank you, Paul. And too, so we have, we'll bring this up quickly in September, but we have had, David has had conversations with Jim about this. So This is a topic, as we know, he raised and is concerned about, and he is in the loop, just to let you all know. Any other thoughts or comments?
Well, I just want to say, as one of the people who voted to support this measure, which was approved by the task force, that I think, I think it's really kind of unfair to go back and rethink things after the task force voted to do it until we see language that kind of justifies the desired outcome. I mean, we can't keep being allowed to go back and relitigate. It's not fair.
Well, I think the intent, what the staff intention is we see what your intent is. We think we can do it perhaps in a way that works better. And that's what they raised. It was not a matter of eliminating or ignoring what we had come up with. That is not their intent. Their intent is to figure out a way that they think is cleaner to address the issue that Jim raised and you as well. So, so that is the intent, to protect exactly what we voted on. That is not in question. Any other thoughts or comments on this? And again, we'll look at all of the rest of this language as we come up in September. Any other issues from staff, from the task force? And then we'll go to the public. Tim, if there is anybody left from attendees, the public who want to say anything. I do want to say on behalf of the task force, and I think the county staff as well, I do appreciate the outreach by a number of HOAs and organizations to county staff to raise concerns or issues, ask questions. It's too bad, obviously, with COVID that we're not able to engage directly with the community, but we do want to hear from you all and appreciate the time and effort that you all have put together to put together presentations and to talk with the individuals. So thank you all for that. Tim, did we have any questions from the public?
I don't see any right now. So just a reminder for those of you who are attending from the public, you can press *3 to raise your hand if you're on the phone. If you're over the web, open up the participant pane and go to the bottom right to use the hand raising feature, and I can call your name up.
While we're waiting, Kim, when is our September meeting?
It is September 21st.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll send around an appointment with that. And like I say, I think that will be our last meeting, say, for a while, which is to say staff will then finish their redraft, send it around to all of us. Then we will somehow figure out how we're going to interact with the community to present it to them. And I don't know if it's 1 or 2 or several meetings or how exactly that will be done. So staff is working on that. And then we'll come together after that for a meeting or 2 to wrap up. So, we're hoping for this calendar year that we can actually, make it only a 2. I keep thinking about Johanna and her, her baby who was born right as we got started with this. Then the child will be in kindergarten by the time we wrap this project up. But that said, 2.5 years working on it, and again, appreciate everybody who's been working so hard and so engaged. So thank you all very much. All right, so with that, I think we will adjourn the meeting and see you in September. Thank you.
Thank you.